Temple and Timaeus, Introduction. This video is the first part in a reading of Temple and Timaeus, a paper on the website of one of my favorite Bible scholars, Margaret Barker. It is available as a chapter in her book, The Great High Priest. You can check out. I am sharing this much of it here since it's available free. It is about how many elements of Greek philosophy, specifically Pythagoreanism and Platonism, might plausibly derive from the traditions of the First Temple of Jerusalem. Before I begin, I should put in the disclaimer that while I am a great fan of Margaret, she tends to look at things through a feminist and environmentalist and preterist lens, among some others. Her books are available on Amazon and other online retailers. I particularly recommend The Great Angel, Israel's Second God, Temple Mysticism, and her book on the Gospel of John. Let us begin. If therefore it should be shown to you that Plato and his successors have agreed in their philosophy with the Hebrews, it is time to examine the date at which he lived and to compare the antiquity of the Hebrew theologians and prophets with the age of the philosophers of Greece. Eusebius, Preparation for the Gospel, Book 10, Chapter 14. Pythagoras brought this teaching to Greece, along with the rest of Kabbalah. If I declare that Kabbalah and Pythagoreanism are of the same stuff, I will not be departing from facts. Johann Reuchlin, On the Art of Kabbalah, Book 2, 1517. The Jews claimed that their traditions and scriptures had influenced the Greeks, not just at the end of the Second Temple period, but in the very earliest period of Greek philosophy. Josephus believed that Pythagoras had been influenced by the teachings of the Jews and quoted the work of Hermippus on Pythagoras, to the effect that his teachings had been in imitation of the doctrines of the Jews and Thracians, which he transferred into his own philosophy, in Against Apion, Book 1, Chapter 22. Josephus offered many examples of Jews in contact with the Greeks, including an incident when Aristotle engaged in learned debate with a Jew in Asia Minor. Clement of Alexandria in his Miscellanies listed many who had benefited from the teachings of the Jews. Numa, king of the Romans, although Pythagorean, benefited from the teachings of Moses and forbade the Romans to make an image of God. He quoted Aristobulus. Plato, too, had followed our legislation and had evidently studied carefully the several precepts contained in it. He claimed that the story of the Exodus and the law of Moses had been translated into Greek before the time of Alexander the Great, and that Pythagoras transferred many of our precepts to his own system of doctrines. He quoted Numinus, the Pythagorean philosopher, "For what is Plato but Moses speaking in Attic Greek?" Miscellanies, Book 1, Chapter 15. Plato and Pythagoras are the names that occur time and again. Origen's work against Celsus was another aspect of this debate. Was Christianity just Platonism for the masses? Celsus had attacked the pretensions of Christianity that their religion was the ancient wisdom that had inspired the Greek philosophers. Eusebius devoted the whole of his 15-volume work, The Preparation for the Gospel, to this same subject. He took elements from Plato and showed that they were derived from the Hebrew Scriptures. Plato altered the oracle, "I am that I am," into "what is that which always is and has no beginning." And now, besides the description, God holding the beginning and end and middle of all things, set, "I, God, am the first, and I am with the last." The argument in the Timaeus that there had been one pattern for the creation presupposed belief in one God. The Creator in the Timaeus is good, as is the God of the Hebrew Scriptures. The philosophy of Plato, he concluded, was in very many things in agreement with the doctrine of the Hebrews. It would be easy to dismiss these texts as predictable claims to national or confessional superiority and not to be taken seriously, but this would be a mistake. The similarity between much of Plato and the Hebrew tradition is too great for coincidence. Even though the current fashion is to date many of the Hebrew scriptures in the Persian period, to suggest that Plato, who died in 348 BCE, was an influence on their formation would require a very late date indeed. If we go behind Plato to Pythagoras, acknowledged to have been an influence on the later philosopher, even though the precise extent of that influence is still debated, another possibility emerges. The link between Plato and the Hebrew Scriptures could have been through Pythagoras, as the ancient apologist had said. A glance at the dates involved and a simple study of feasibility shows that such claims could have been well-founded. There are striking similarities, and if we allow for the fact that the teachings attributed to Pythagoras have been for the most part rationalized and presented as science, whereas the parallel Hebrew texts are in still the form of myths and worship material, the case for Pythagoras having had contact with the older Hebrew tradition is strong. It is necessary to look first at the very little known of and claimed for the life and original teachings of Pythagoras, and then to attempt to trace his influence through into Plato and especially into Timaeus. In popular perception of the history of ancient Greece, the 6th century is antiquity, the era of the 7 sages. Yet the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 586 BCE, and most of what we consider Old Testament history had happened by that time. The latest date proposed for Ezra, 398 BC, but most would put him 60 years earlier, coincides with the death of Socrates in 399 BC. The pre-Socratic philosophers flourished at the very end of the Old Testament period. We also read, "Over the origins of Greek philosophy and science lies the shadow of a great traditional name. This name is Pythagoras of Samos, who lived in the 6th century at the very time when the great changes were taking place in Jerusalem. After a period of skepticism, scholars are now more confident about the value of certain ancient sources for reconstructing the life and thought of Pythagoras. And so it is of considerable interest to note that Iamblichus' Life of Pythagoras, that Pythagoras traveled in his youth, that he went to Sidon, conversed with the Phoenician hierophants, and was initiated in all the mysteries of Biblios and Tyre, and into the sacred operations which are performed in many parts of Syria. He lived in a Phoenician temple at Mount Carmel before traveling on to Egypt. Herodotus, who lived about a century after Pythagoras, described people in Palestine as Syrians who practiced circumcision. And so it is not impossible that the temples of Syria, which Pythagoras knew, included those of the Hebrews. Eusebius speculated in a similar way. Pythagoras spent some time with the Persian magi and became a disciple of the Egyptian prophets at the time when some of the Hebrews appeared to have made their settlements in Egypt and some in Babylon. Although the dates of his life are not known for certain, he must have been in the area of Palestine before the return of the people from Babylon and the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. And he must have been in Egypt and Babylon during the exile, since there is archaeological evidence which may indicate the presence of Greeks in the late 1st Temple Jerusalem, the end of the 7th century BCE. It is not impossible that the young Pythagoras came that way on his travels, and that he had contact with the thought of the First Temple. This is very important because most of the evidence for the teachings of Pythagoras shows that it was very similar to what can be reconstructed of the teachings and practices of the First Temple priesthood. Dates are all important. Despite the recent trend among Old Testament scholars to date the Hebrew scriptures in the Persian period or even later, few would deny the authenticity of the Babylonian record that a city named Jerusalem was attacked at the beginning of the 6th century BC. There was something there. Scholars are also putting increased emphasis on the extent to which the Hebrew scriptures were written to express one particular point of view, that of the returned exiles, or Persian colonists in the more extreme views, at the expense of anything that might have existed earlier. Nor does anyone doubt that one of the curious characteristics of the books of Samuel and Kings, the former prophets, is their discrediting of the history and achievements of the older regime in Jerusalem. The literary remains alone indicate a massive cultural disruption in the 6th century, and the consistency of the evidence elsewhere suggests that this disruption centered on the temple and its priesthood, Messiah, and then physically destroyed by the Babylonians. All the evidence elsewhere, however, shows that this was far from being an accurate and sympathetic account of the First Temple. This means that whatever Pythagoras might have learned of Hebrew tradition will not be in the surface text of the present Hebrew scriptures. If Pythagoras had traveled in this region, as the tradition records, he would have met with the Older Testament. He would have known the older creation story, perhaps even the world of Job, holy name for God, where the earth was measured and the sons of God sang together as they witnessed the creation. He would have known of a 7-base number system which antedated the 2 versions of the faith, the one based on the Moses and Exodus traditions, the other on the days of the creation. He would perhaps have known the astronomers and astrologers who knew the correspondence of heaven and earth, and who produced the curious and complex treatises which have survived only among the Enoch texts, revealed by the angel Uriel to Enoch the high priest figure. The great hall of the temple which Enoch knew had a pattern of stars on its ceiling, and as late as the early 3rd century BC, Theophrastus could describe the Jews as a nation of philosophers, who sat up at night looking at the stars. In the First Temple there had been rooftop altars and equipment for the host of heaven, until the reforming Josiah removed them. This is not the Old Testament world which we are familiar, but it could well have been what the young Pythagoras found in the 6th century.